Thomas Harrison had been serving as a royal guard for 12 years, and he thought he had seen everything. Standing at his post outside Westminster Palace on that gray Tuesday morning in October, he watched the usual flow of tourists, government, workers, and London residents going about their daily routines. At 34 years old, Thomas was known among his colleagues for his sharp attention to detail and his ability to spot trouble before it escalated. The morning had started like any other. Thomas had kissed his wife Catherine goodbye at their small flat in South London, promising to be home in time for dinner with their twin daughters, Lucy and Sophie, who were both 7 years old. The girls had made him promise to tell them stories about his day when he returned, and Thomas always made sure to find something interesting to share with them, even if it was just describing the different types of birds he had seen or the funny conversations he had overheard between tourists as Thomas took his position at the main entrance. He noticed the usual mix of people gathering for the morning shift change ceremony. School groups with excited children, elderly couples with guidebooks, and young backpackers taking selfies filled the area. The October air was crisp, and fallen leaves scattered across the pavement with each gust of wind. Around 10:30 in the morning, Thomas noticed a small girl standing alone near the wrought iron fence. She appeared to be about 8 years old, with long brown hair tied in pigtails and wearing a bright blue school uniform. What caught Thomas's attention wasn't unusual about her appearance, but rather her behavior. While other children in the area were chattering excitedly with their families or school groups, this little girl stood perfectly still, her eyes darting nervously around the crowd. The girl clutched a small pink backpack against her chest and kept looking over her shoulder, as if she was expecting someone to appear behind her. Thomas had been trained to notice when people seemed out of place or distressed, and everything about this child's body language suggested she was frightened. Her shoulders were hunched, and she kept taking small steps backward toward the fence. As if she wanted to disappear, Thomas maintained his professional posture while keeping a careful eye on the situation. He watched as several adults passed by the girl without seeming to notice her distress. A group of teenagers walked past, laughing loudly about something on their phones. A businessman hurried by, checking his watch and speaking rapidly into a Bluetooth headset. An elderly woman with a shopping bag paused to look at the palace architecture, but didn't seem to register the scared child, standing just a few feet away. After about 10 minutes of observation, Thomas became increasingly concerned. The girl hadn't moved from her spot, hadn't approached any adult for help, and hadn't shown any signs of looking for lost parents or teachers. Instead, she seemed to be hiding, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible while remaining in plain sight. Then Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. A man in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, was moving through the crowd in a way that seemed deliberately casual but focused. The man would pause to look at his phone, pretend to read tourist information, signs, and occasionally glance around as if he was looking for something or someone. What alarmed Thomas most was the pattern of the man's movement. He wasn't wandering randomly like a tourist or walking purposefully like someone with a destination. Instead, he was systematically searching the area, his eyes scanning faces in the crowd with an intensity that didn't match his casual demeanor. Every few minutes, his gaze would settle on the little girl by the fence. Thomas could see recognition in the man's expression. The girl had noticed the man too. Thomas watched as her already tense posture became even more rigid when she spotted him. Her grip on her backpack tightened, and she took another step backward until she was pressed against the iron fence. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, and Thomas realized he was witnessing something much more serious than a lost child waiting for her parents. Thomas had received training on recognizing signs of human trafficking and child abduction, but he had never expected to encounter such a situation during his regular duties. The protocols were clear about maintaining his post and calling for backup through proper channels. But something about the little girl's terror and the man's predatory behavior made Thomas's protective instincts override his standard procedures. Man began moving more directly toward the girl, no longer pretending to be a casual observer. He pulled out his phone and appeared to be texting someone, his eyes never leaving the frightened child. Thomas could see the girl's breathing becoming more rapid and shallow as she realized the man was approaching her. Position Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Breaking from his rigid stance for the first time in his 12-year career, he began to move. His training and his instincts as a father were telling him that this little girl was in immediate danger and that waiting for proper backup might be too late to help her. The girl looked up and saw Thomas approaching. Instead of the relief that might be expected when a uniformed officer comes to help, her expression showed confusion and uncertainty. She didn't know whether this tall man in the elaborate red uniform was someone who could help her or just another adult she couldn't trust. Thomas realized he would need to be very careful about how he handled the next few minutes. Thomas approached the frightened girl slowly, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. His years of experience had taught him that scared children needed to feel safe before they could accept help. He knelt down to her eye level, making himself appear less imposing while still maintaining awareness of the suspicious man who was now only about 20 feet away. "Hello there," Thomas said gently, his voice warm and reassuring. "My name is Thomas, and I'm here to keep people safe. Are you okay?" The little girl looked at him with wide, frightened eyes but didn't respond immediately. Thomas could see that she was trembling slightly, and her knuckles were white from gripping her backpack so tightly. "Scared?" she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that Thomas had to lean closer to hear her. "That man over there keeps following me, and I don't know where my mummy is." She glanced quickly toward the man in the baseball cap, but stopped his approach when he saw Thomas interacting with the girl. Thomas felt his heart break at the fear in her voice, but he also felt a surge of protective anger toward anyone who would terrorize a child this way. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle while his eyes tracked the suspicious man's movements. "Lily," she replied, still clutching her backpack. "Lily Morrison. I was walking to school this morning when that man grabbed me and put me in his car. He drove me here and told me to wait for him while he made a phone call, but I ran away when he wasn't looking." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, as if she had been holding them back for hours. Thomas felt his blood turn to ice as he processed what Lily had just told him. This wasn't a case of a lost child or even a custody dispute. This was an active kidnapping situation, and the perpetrator was standing just 20 feet away, probably deciding whether to flee or attempt to reclaim his victim. "You did exactly the right thing by running away, Lily," Thomas said firmly, while discreetly reaching for his radio to call for backup. "You're very brave, and I'm going to make sure you get back to your mummy safely." He could see relief beginning to replace some of the terror in her eyes as she realized she had found someone who believed her and wanted to help. The man in the baseball cap had been watching their interaction. Thomas could see him becoming agitated as he realized his plans were being disrupted. The man began walking toward them again, this time more quickly and with obvious purpose. Thomas stood up, positioning himself between Lily and her potential abductor while still trying to appear calm. "Lily, there you are," the man called out as he approached, his voice artificially cheerful and loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Your mother sent me to find you. She's been worried sick." The performance was clearly intended to make bystanders think this was a harmless family situation, but Thomas could see the calculation and desperation in the man's eyes. Lily pressed herself against Thomas's legs, her fear returning with full force as her abductor approached. "It's not true," she said loudly, though her voice shook with terror. "I don't know him. He's the one who took me." Her words carried clearly across the area, causing several nearby tourists to stop and look in their direction with concern. Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a ceremonial guard maintaining a post. He was the only thing standing between a terrified child and someone who meant her harm. His training told him to wait for backup and follow established protocols. But his instincts as a father and a protector told him that Lily's safety depended on his actions in the next few critical minutes. The man stopped about 10 feet away, clearly recognizing that his approach had failed and that Thomas wasn't going to step aside. "Look, officer," the man said, his tone becoming more aggressive. "This is a family matter. The girl is confused and scared, but her mother really did send me to collect her." Thomas studied the man's face carefully, noting the nervous sweat on his forehead despite the cool October air, the way his hands kept fidgeting in his pockets, and most importantly, the complete lack of genuine concern for Lily's welfare. Everything about his demeanor screamed deception and danger. "If that's true," Thomas replied calmly, "then you won't mind waiting while I verify that with the proper authorities." He keyed his radio with one hand while keeping his other arm protectively. In front of Lily, Mrs. Guard Harrison requesting immediate backup at the main entrance. "We have a possible child abduction in progress." The man's expression changed instantly from false friendliness to open hostility. "You're making a big mistake," he snarled, taking another step forward. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in." The threat was clear, and Thomas realized that the situation was about to escalate dramatically. Thomas looked down at Lily, who was looking up at him with complete trust, despite having known him for only a few minutes. In her eyes, he saw his own daughters, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would do whatever it took to protect this brave little girl from the man who had already terrorized her once that day. The tension in the air became thick as Thomas and the kidnapper faced each other in what was quickly becoming a dangerous standoff. Thomas could hear his radio crackling with responses from his fellow guards and police units, but he knew that backup was still several minutes away, a situation involving a child's safety. Several minutes could make the difference between rescue and tragedy. The man's aggressive demeanor suddenly shifted again. Thomas recognized the change as even more dangerous than his previous hostility. The kidnapper began looking around frantically, clearly realizing that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. His desperation was making him unpredictable, and Thomas knew from his training that desperate criminals often made reckless decisions that put everyone at risk. "Lily," Thomas said quietly, without taking his eyes off the man, "I need you to walk very slowly toward that group of police officers who are coming this way." Thomas had spotted 2 uniformed Metropolitan Police constables who had been patrolling the area and were now responding to his radio call. They were still about 50 yards away, but they were approaching quickly. Lily looked toward the approaching officers, then back at Thomas with uncertainty. "What about you?" she asked, her voice filled with concern that touched Thomas's heart. Even in her terror, this brave little girl was worried about the man who was trying to protect her. "I'm going to make sure that man doesn't follow you," Thomas replied firmly, maintaining his protective stance between Lily and her abductor. "But I need you to go to those police officers right now. Can you do that for me?" Lily nodded, though Thomas could see the fear in her eyes at the thought of leaving his protection. The kidnapper had overheard their exchange. Thomas could see him calculating his next move. The man's eyes darted between Lily's small form, Thomas's imposing figure, and the approaching police officers. Thomas recognized the look of someone who was about to make a desperate gambit, and every one of his protective instincts went on high alert. "Nobody needs to get hurt here," the man said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that didn't match the menace in his eyes. "Just let me take the girl, and everyone can walk away from this situation." As he spoke, Thomas noticed the man's right hand moving slowly towards something in his jacket pocket. Thomas had seen enough criminals in his years of service to recognize when someone was reaching for a weapon. His training kicked in automatically, and he began calculating distances, escape routes, and the fastest way to neutralize a threat while keeping Lily safe. The crowd of tourists around them had begun to sense that something was wrong, and people were starting to move away from the area. "Lily, run to those officers now," Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed immediately. The little girl didn't hesitate this time, clutching her pink backpack and running as fast as her small legs could carry her toward the approaching police constables. The moment Lily began running, the kidnapper made his move. He lunged forward, clearly intending to chase after her, but Thomas was ready. Using his superior size and training, Thomas stepped directly into the man's path and caught him in a restraining hold that prevented him from pursuing the fleeing child. "Let me go," the man shouted, struggling against Thomas's grip while trying to reach into his jacket pocket. "You don't understand what you've done. There are people involved in this who will make you pay for interfering." The threats only confirmed Thomas's assessment that this was a serious criminal operation. It's not just an opportunistic crime. Thomas maintained his hold while calling out to the approaching officers, Armed suspect attempting to abduct the child, he shouted, making sure. His voice carried clearly across the area. Possible weapon in right jacket pocket. The information helped the police constables assess the threat level as they closed the remaining distance. The struggle between Thomas and the kidnapper intensified as the man realized he was about to be captured. He threw his weight around wildly, trying to break free from Thomas's restraining hold, but Thomas's years of physical training and his determination to protect Lily gave him the strength to maintain control of the situation. Meanwhile, Lily had reached the first police officer, a young woman constable who immediately knelt down to comfort the terrified child. Thomas could see the officer speaking gently to Lily while radioing for additional support and medical assistance. The sight of Lily being comforted by another protector allowed Thomas to focus entirely on subduing her abductor without worrying about her immediate safety. The second police officer, a veteran sergeant with over 20 years of experience, approached. The struggle between Thomas and the kidnapper with his hand on his weapon. Release him and step back. Guard Harrison, the sergeant ordered, taking control of the situation. We'll take it from here. Thomas carefully released his hold on the kidnapper and stepped back as instructed. But he remained ready to intervene again if the man tried to escape or pose a threat to anyone else in the area. His adrenaline was still pumping from the confrontation, and he could feel his hand shaking slightly as the intensity of the situation began to register. The sergeant quickly cuffed the kidnapper, while his partner continued to comfort Lily and gather preliminary information about what had happened. Thomas watched as the man who had terrorized an 8-year-old girl was led away in handcuffs, finally unable to hurt Lily or anyone else. As the kidnapper was led away in handcuffs, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and concern wash over him. Lily was safe, but he knew his actions had consequences that extended far beyond this single incident. Breaking protocol to leave his post, even to save a child, was a serious matter that would require investigation and review by his superiors. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh arrived on the scene within minutes of the arrest, having been called in to handle what had quickly become a major case. She was a specialist in crimes against children, with 15 years of experience investigating kidnapping and trafficking cases. Her reputation for thoroughness and her dedication to protecting victims had earned her respect throughout the Metropolitan Police. Guard Harrison, Detective Walsh said as she approached Thomas, "I need to get a complete statement from you about what happened here." Her tone was professional, but not unfriendly, and Thomas could see that she understood the gravity of what had occurred. "But first I want to thank you. Your quick thinking and courage may have saved that little girl's life." Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders at her words. He had been prepared for criticism about abandoning his post, but Detective Walsh seemed to understand that some situations required immediate action regardless of protocol. "I just did what any parent would do," Thomas replied modestly. "I couldn't stand by and watch a child in danger." Meanwhile, Lily was being cared for by specially trained victim support officers who had arrived to help her through the trauma of her ordeal. Thomas could see her sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a warm blanket and sipping hot chocolate, while a kind female officer sat beside her. Despite everything she had been through, Lily kept looking around the scene until she spotted Thomas, then gave him a small wave that nearly broke his heart. Detective Walsh followed Thomas's gaze and smiled. "She keeps asking about the brave guard who saved her," she said warmly. "She's told us several times that you were the first adult who listened to her and believed what she was saying. That means everything to a child who's been through what she experienced." As the investigation unfolded over the following hours, the true scope of what Thomas had prevented began to emerge. The kidnapper, identified as Robert Hayes, was part of a larger criminal network that specialized in trafficking children. His phone contained evidence of communications with other members of the organization, including plans to transport Lily out of the country that very afternoon. "If you hadn't intervened when you did," Detective Walsh explained to Thomas during his formal interview, Lily would have disappeared into a network that spans multiple countries. Cases like that become nearly impossible to solve, and the victims are rarely recovered safely. The weight of that revelation settled heavily on Thomas as he realized how close they had come to losing Lily forever. The investigation revealed that Lily had been specifically targeted because she walked to school alone each morning along a quiet street. Hayes had been watching her routine for several days before making his move. He had grabbed her just 2 blocks from her school, forced her into his car, and driven her to the Palace area while waiting for instructions from his criminal contacts. Lily's escape from Hayes had been a moment of incredible bravery and quick thinking. When he had stepped away from the car to make a phone call, she had quietly opened the door and run toward the largest group of people she could see, hoping to find safety in the crowd. Her decision to run toward the palace where guards and police were always present had been instinctive but brilliant. Thomas's commanding officer, Colonel James Patterson, arrived at the scene to assess the situation and determine what disciplinary action might be necessary. Colonel Patterson was known for being strict about protocol and discipline, but he was also a fair man who understood that exceptional circumstances sometimes required exceptional responses. "Guard Harrison," Colonel Patterson said formally, "you left your assigned post without authorization and engaged in police activities outside your jurisdiction." Thomas stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever consequences his actions had earned. However, the colonel continued, "You also prevented a serious crime and likely saved a child's life. That requires careful consideration." The media had begun to gather at the scene as word of the rescue spread. Thomas could see news vans arriving and reporters setting up their equipment, preparing to cover what was already being described as a heroic intervention by a royal guard. He felt uncomfortable with the attention, knowing that he had simply done what felt right in the moment. Lily's parents arrived at the scene in a state of panic and relief. That was heartbreaking to witness. Her mother, Jennifer Morrison, collapsed, in tears when she saw her daughter safe in the ambulance. Her father, Michael Morrison, struggled to find words to express his gratitude to Thomas and the police officers who had protected his little girl. "Thank you," Jennifer Morrison said to Thomas through her tears as she held Lily close. "Thank you for listening to her and believing her when she needed help most. I don't know how we can ever repay you." Thomas was moved by her gratitude, but insisted that any parent would have done the same thing in his position. Lily looked up at Thomas from her mother's embrace and smiled with the resilience that only children possess. "Mummy," she said clearly, "Thomas is a real hero. Kept me safe when the scary man wanted to hurt me." Her simple words carried more meaning than any official commendation Thomas could have received as the immediate crisis concluded, and the various officials began their investigations and reports. Thomas realized that his life had changed forever. His decision to break protocol and protect a frightened child had set in motion a series of events that would have consequences he couldn't yet imagine. The days following the rescue were unlike anything Thomas had experienced in his 12 years of service. The story had captured the public's imagination. News outlets around the world were covering the royal guard who had risked his career to save a kidnapped child. Thomas found himself thrust into a spotlight that made him deeply uncomfortable. As he had always preferred to serve quietly and without fanfare, Colonel Patterson called Thomas into his office 3 days after the incident for what Thomas expected would be a formal disciplinary hearing. The colonel's office was filled with commendations, photographs, and military memorabilia from his 30-year career, and Thomas had always found it intimidating. Today, however, the atmosphere felt different. "Guard Harrison," Colonel Patterson began, settling behind his large wooden desk, "I've completed my review of your actions during the incident on Tuesday morning." Thomas stood at rigid attention, prepared to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate for abandoning his post. "I've also received calls from the Prime Minister's office, Scotland Yard, and 3 different child protection organizations." Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he wondered what those calls might have contained. Breaking protocol was a serious offense, regardless of the outcome, and he knew that military discipline required consistent enforcement of rules and regulations. "The consensus from everyone I've spoken with," Colonel Patterson continued, "is that you demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment, courage, and dedication to protecting others that we hope to see in every member of our service." Thomas felt relief began to replace his anxiety, though he maintained his professional composure. However, the colonel added, and Thomas braced himself for the inevitable criticism. Your actions also highlighted some gaps in our current protocols for handling emergency situations involving civilians. We're going to be implementing new training procedures based on what happened, and I want you to help develop those programs. Thomas was stunned by the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. Instead of punishment, he was being asked to help improve the service's response to similar situations in the future. Sir, I would be honored to contribute to any training improvements, he replied formally. The media attention continued to grow throughout the week, with interview requests pouring in from television programs, newspapers, and online publications around the world. Thomas had declined most of these requests, uncomfortable with being portrayed as a hero for doing what he considered his basic duty as a human being. The investigation into the kidnapping ring had expanded dramatically following Hayes's arrest. Detective Inspector Walsh had contacted Thomas several times to update him on the progress of the case and to prepare him for the eventual trial proceedings. The evidence found on Hayes's phone had led to arrests in 3 other countries and the rescue of 4 additional children who had already been trafficked. Your intervention didn't just save Lily, Detective Walsh explained during one of their conversations. It broke open an entire criminal network that we've been trying to track for 2 years. The intelligence we gathered from Hayes and his associates is helping law enforcement agencies across Europe rescue victims and arrest traffickers. Thomas was amazed by the far-reaching impact of those few critical minutes outside the palace. What had seemed like a simple decision to help a frightened child, it disrupted an international criminal organization and potentially saved dozens of other children from similar fates. Lily and her family had sent Thomas a handwritten thank you card that he treasured more than any official recognition he might receive. Lily's careful, childish handwriting thanked him for being the nicest guard in the whole world, and included a drawing of the 2 of them standing together outside the palace. Her parents had added their own message, expressing gratitude that would last their entire lifetimes. The royal family had taken notice of the incident as well. Thomas received word that he was being considered for a special commendation that recognized service members who had gone above and beyond their duties to protect others. The possibility of receiving such recognition from the monarchy felt surreal to Thomas, who had never expected his military career to bring him to such attention. Thomas's wife Catherine had initially been terrified when she learned about the incident from news reports rather than from Thomas himself. The confrontation with an armed kidnapper could have ended tragically, and she struggled with the knowledge that her husband had put himself in serious danger. However, as she learned more about Lily's situation and saw the impact Thomas's actions had on preventing further crimes, her fear transformed into immense pride. I married a hero, Catherine told Thomas one evening, as they watched their own daughters playing safely in their garden. I always knew you were brave, but seeing how you protected someone else's child makes me love you even more. Her words meant more to Thomas than any public recognition ever could. Lucy and Sophie, Thomas's 7-year-old twins, had become celebrities at their school when their classmates learned that their father was the royal guard everyone was talking about. On television, they begged Thomas to tell them the story over and over again, and he always emphasized the importance of helping others who are in trouble and speaking up when someone needs protection. The incident had also sparked broader conversations about child safety, the importance of believing children when they report dangerous situations, and the role that ordinary citizens can play in preventing crimes. Thomas found himself invited to speak at schools and community organizations about recognizing signs of danger and taking appropriate action to help others. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to understand that his moment of decision outside the palace had changed not only his own life, but also the lives of countless others. The criminal network's disruption had prevented future kidnappings. Protocol changes would better prepare other guards for similar situations, and the public attention had raised awareness about child trafficking in ways that could protect other potential victims. Thomas realized that sometimes the most important moments in life come without warning, requiring instant decisions that can have lasting consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine at the time. 6 months after the rescue, Thomas stood in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, wearing his finest dress uniform and feeling more nervous than he had during the actual confrontation with the kidnapper. He was about to receive the George Medal, one of the highest civilian awards for gallantry, from Her Majesty the Queen herself. The ceremony was attended by his family, colleagues, and several of the other law enforcement officers who had been involved in dismantling the trafficking network. Lily Morrison was also present at the ceremony, accompanied by her parents and wearing a beautiful blue dress that matched the color of the school uniform she had been wearing on that frightening October morning. She had recovered remarkably well from her ordeal thanks to excellent counseling support and the love of her family, but she still occasionally had nightmares about the scary man who had taken her. "Guard Harrison," the Queen said as Thomas approached the podium. "Your actions on that October morning exemplified the very best qualities of service, courage, and compassion. You risked your career and your safety to protect a child in danger, and in doing so, you prevented countless other children from suffering similar fates." Her words carried the weight of centuries of royal recognition for extraordinary service. As the Queen pinned the medal to Thomas's uniform, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The simple decision to help a frightened child had led to international recognition, protocol changes that would benefit future victims, and the disruption of a criminal network that had terrorized families across Europe. The trial of Robert Hayes and his associates had concluded just 2 weeks earlier, with all the defendants receiving lengthy prison sentences. Detective Inspector Walsh had testified that Thomas's intervention had been crucial not only in saving Lily but also in providing the evidence needed to convict the entire criminal organization. The judge had specifically commended Thomas's quick thinking and courage during the sentencing. Following the ceremony, Thomas had the opportunity to speak privately with Lily and her family. The little girl had grown taller and more confident in the months since their first meeting, though she still remembered every detail of the day Thomas had saved her. "Mummy says you're famous now," Lily said with the directness that only children possess. "But I knew you were special right from the beginning." Jennifer Morrison still became emotional whenever she spoke about that October morning. "Lily talks about you all the time," she told Thomas. "She says that when she grows up, she wants to help protect other children the way you protected her. You've inspired her to think about becoming a police officer or a guard herself someday." The media attention had gradually decreased over the months, but Thomas still received letters from around the world thanking him for his actions and sharing stories of how his example had inspired others to help people in need. Parents wrote about teaching their children to be brave like Guard Harrison. Several people shared accounts of intervening in dangerous situations. Because they had been inspired by his courage, Thomas had indeed become involved in developing new training protocols for the Royal Guards and other security services. The program, now known as the Harrison Protocol, provided specific guidelines for recognizing and responding to crimes against children while maintaining security responsibilities. The training had already been implemented in several other countries and had led to the rescue of additional victims. The disruption of the trafficking network had had far-reaching effects beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The 4 children who had been rescued in the follow-up operations had been reunited with their families, and the intelligence gathered had helped law enforcement agencies identify and shut down several other criminal organizations operating throughout Europe and Asia. Detective Inspector Walsh had been promoted partly based on her successful handling of the trafficking case, and she maintained regular contact with Thomas about ongoing investigations and prevention efforts. "You started something that day that's still saving lives," she told him during one of their meetings. "Every time we use the intelligence from that case to rescue another child, it's partly because of your decision to act." Thomas returned to his regular duties at the palace, though his experience had given him a new perspective on his role as a protector. He found himself more attuned to the people around him, more aware of potential signs of distress or danger, and more confident in his ability to make quick decisions when others needed help. His daughters, Lucy and Sophie, had grown up proud of their father's actions, though Thomas always emphasized to them that real heroism wasn't about dramatic rescues, but about the everyday choice to help others when they need support. They often accompanied him to school visits, where he spoke about child safety and the importance of trusting adults who wanted to help. Catherine had returned to her work as a primary school teacher with a renewed focus on teaching children about safety and the importance of speaking up when they feel threatened. She often shared Thomas's story as an example of how adults should respond when children need protection, emphasizing that every child deserves to be believed and helped. On quiet evenings at home, Thomas would sometimes think about how different everything might have been if he had followed protocol and waited for backup that October morning. Lily might have disappeared forever. The trafficking network might have continued operating, and dozens of other children might have suffered terrible fates. The George Medal sat in a place of honor in the Harrison family's modest home. But Thomas knew that the real reward for his actions wasn't the recognition or the media attention. It was the knowledge that Lily Morrison was safe, that other children had been rescued because of the investigation his intervention had triggered, and that his own daughters were growing up in a world where adults were willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. Thomas had learned that heroism wasn't about seeking glory or recognition, about making the right choice in critical moments, even when that choice came with significant personal cost. His decision to leave his post and protect a frightened child had changed countless lives, proving that sometimes the most important thing any person can do is simply choose to help someone who needs it, regardless of the consequences.